Good morning. It's Monday, July 22nd. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 290 days old. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, Senior Vice President for Research at Foundation for Defensive Democracies. Welcome back yet again to the FDD Morning Brief. I don't think I need to say this, but I'll say it anyway. It was an insane news weekend between President Biden's bombshell announcement and Israel actually bombing the port of Hodeidah in Yemen. It was not easy to keep up, but we'll do our best to unpack it all here live today on the FDD Morning Brief. Our guest this morning will be Yair Zivan. Yair is the right hand to another Yair you may have heard of, Yair Lapid. Lapid, of course, is the current opposition leader in Israel and the former acting prime minister who stepped in and closed out the term of Naftali Bennett. Yair Zivan is the author of a new book called The Center Must Hold. We'll talk to him shortly about his book, The State of Play in Israel, and much more right here on the FDD Morning Brief. I've got two things I want to talk about this morning. I don't think anyone will find that surprising. First, let's talk about Biden's bombshell. President Joe Biden announced yesterday that he will not seek re-election. Folks have been asking me what that means for the war in the Middle East until November. Bottom line, we know Biden will meet still with Bibi during his big visit in Washington. Beyond that, I can't say for sure. There are two schools of thought here. The first, that the president was terrific for Israel in the immediate aftermath of 10/7. But as the war dragged on and progressive politics crept into the picture, his aides forced him to adopt positions that were less helpful to Israel. Biden is a self-described Zionist, and according to this theory, the president might have a freer hand now that he is unburdened, if you will, by the prospect of re-election. In other words, without all the politics, Biden might just handle foreign policy in the Middle East the way that he believes justice demands. Indeed, he could seize the opportunity to be more pro-Israel yet again. The second school of thought is decidedly less optimistic. This school of thought holds that Biden has been managed by his staff for months as he began to experience cognitive decline. And those cognitive issues are still a problem. Therefore, the president's policies will still be managed by his people. With this scenario, nothing is likely to change. How do things play out? It's hard to say, but I do worry that America's adversaries may try to take advantage of what's bound to be a chaotic few months ahead here in the United States. In other news, the Israelis finally did it. They bombed the Houthi-controlled port city of Hodeidah in Yemen, sending fireballs high into the sky. The strike was important for several reasons. First, as we all know, the Israelis have absorbed dozens of Houthi attacks since the war began. A response was long overdue. This is the only way deterrence can possibly be restored. Second, the very sight of a massive explosion on enemy soil was important symbolically. As Amir Ohana, the Speaker of Knesset, tweeted in Arabic, this message is for the entire Middle East. I am fairly certain the Israelis got the attention of all their potential enemies. Message delivered. Third, the port of Hodeidah has long been the place where Iran has shipped its weapons and other military assets to the Houthis. In other words, the Israelis struck the right place. They showed the Iranians that they know what's going on and where. I'm sure there's more where that came from. Finally, the attack in Yemen was quite far from Israel, a few thousand miles to be exact. So with that attack, the Israelis were able to demonstrate to the regime in Iran, which is actually a few hundred miles closer to Israel, that Iran could rather easily be a target too. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. We are watching a regional war unfold here, folks. It was only a matter of time before Israel took action in Yemen. How much longer until Israel strikes Iran and not just a one-off reprisal? If you ask me, it seems like things are moving inexorably in that direction. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, Secretary of State Antony Blinken delivered a stark warning about Iran's accelerating path toward nuclear capability during the recent Aspen Security Forum. 1 week, folks. That's the total amount of time our top diplomat says Iran needs to convert its enriched uranium into weapons-grade material. Hey, Mr. Secretary, this one's for you. You and the rest of the Biden Iran team dismantled many of the sanctions we had in place on the Islamic Republic. You and your pals allowed the world's leading state sponsor of terror to sell its oil to Russia and China, and you approved a sanctions waiver in March that granted Iran access to $10 billion in previously escrowed funds. This administration has opened the financial spigots for Iran. That already has us on the brink of a regional war. And now just imagine what happens if Iran gets the bomb. Foreign policy malpractice. That's what I call it. Headline 2, Qatari forces are now patrolling the streets of Paris. Yes, you heard that right. Ahead of the Summer Olympics, the French have enlisted the help of the Middle East's most corrupt petrostate to provide security for the Games. To refresh your memory, the Qataris are sponsors of Hamas. They're sponsors of the Taliban. They have provided cash and shelter to operatives from Al-Qaeda and ISIS. But I guess we just need to trust them here when they say that they are just trying to maintain order this summer in France. For those keeping score at home, Qatar has plans to invest 10 billion euros in France by 2030, with major stakes in energy, semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and more. And that doesn't include the estimated 8 billion in real estate that Qatar already owns in France, not to mention the Paris Saint-Germain soccer club, large stakes in Louis Vuitton, Total Energy, Airbus, Accor, and more. So no, in case you're wondering, Qatar is not solely interested in buying up assets in the United States. They are doing it in other capitals too. And now they have armed forces in Paris. Lovely. And headline 3, the Shin Bet foiled a Hamas plot in the West Bank yesterday. The cell was a group of students, actually student council members at Birzeit University. They plan to carry out a shooting attack in the West Bank. Security forces confiscated an assault rifle and thousands of dollars in cash. But now for the big reveal. Guess where the direction for this attack came from? I'll give you 3 guesses. Okay, fine. No guesses. The direction came from Turkey, where dozens of top Hamas operatives continue to find protection from the Islamist dictatorship in Ankara, which is, of course, also a NATO ally. At some point, Erdogan will need to pay a price for all of this. Okay. Now it's time for my interview with Yair Zivan. Yair is a thoughtful and articulate politico in Israel. He has been Yair Lapid's right-hand man for more than a decade, if I'm not mistaken. He was right in the thick of it during the year that Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid ran the show in Jerusalem. Today, he's still advising Lapid, who leads Israel's opposition. And Yair's got a new book out right now called The Center Must Hold. We'll talk to him live right now on the FDD Morning Brief. Welcome to the FDD Morning Brief, Yair Zivan.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. All right. Well, first, let me ask you about what I think everybody in Israel is talking about, that counter strike on Yemen, the Houthis over there. How is that playing out in Israel and across the region? Are we now at another phase in what I would call the 10-7 wars?
Well, I think that's now in the hands of other regional players. I think Israel made its position pretty clear with actions and not with words about what the response will be to further strikes. And I think that was the right thing to do. We needed to send that message to the region. And now there is a choice about where this goes. We've said for a long time now that the price that we extract has to be directly from the source that's firing at us. This idea that the Iranians can fire at Israel through various proxies and then we respond through small strikes reportedly in places like Iraq and Syria rather than hitting the main targets wasn't sustainable. So I think there is pretty much consensus in Israel that this was the right move. It was the right thing to do. And you don't get away with striking at Tel Aviv with drones or striking at Israel at all.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess I just need to ask this. I think I know the answer, but the psychological impact of that drone strike, right? I mean, it looks like the Houthis somehow penetrated Fortress Tel Aviv, right? That has to have an impact on Israelis.
It does, but I would say, look, especially after the last 10 months that we've had, the Israeli public is tough. And if anybody thinks that a UAV on Tel Aviv is going to be what breaks us or what breaks our spirit, then they misread where the Israeli public is. The Israeli public is strong and tough and knows how to withstand these things. We expect a response. And I think, even from the opposition, we can say it was good that the government responded and the army responded the way that they did.
Hey, look at that. A little bit of praise from the opposition. All right.
Just a bit.
Just a bit. Okay. What about the announcement of President Biden yesterday to drop out of the race? How are Israelis viewing that right now? I know he was well loved in the first months of the war, maybe a little less so over the last couple of months. But how would you describe the response in Israel? And I suppose specifically from your camp, from the opposition?
Look, I don't have to tell you that everything that happens in American politics has an impact everywhere in the world, and the ripples are felt particularly keenly in Israel today. I think President Biden has stood by Israel in an incredibly positive way in the last 10 months. The carrier groups, the speeches, the clear messaging, Israelis are really grateful for that. And you have to remember that in the days post October 7th, when the Israeli public felt that the government kind of disappeared on them and wasn't really there to provide that sense of comfort and security and stability that we needed, it was President Biden that stepped up in an incredibly impressive way. And I think he'll be remembered for that in Israel for a long time. Israelis have a tendency to think that things are about us, but I don't think this decision is really anything to do with us. And in the end, whatever happens in November happens. We have no impact over it. It's not our choice. And the Israeli strategic interest is always to work with whoever the American public chooses and to work with them as well as we can.
What do you expect from Bibi and Biden over the next couple of days? We've got some, I suppose, some very public, I don't want to call it drama, but some public appearances. What do you expect comes of it?
So I don't necessarily know what to expect. I know what I hope. And this is the thing that most Israelis care about. And this is the thing that should be at the center of the conversations and the center of the speech in Congress. And that's bringing the hostages home. That is the number one priority for the people of Israel today. Overwhelmingly, in every opinion poll you see, that is what the Israeli public wants. And a deal to bring back the hostages, we now understand is possible. It's within reach. It's not a foregone conclusion. It's not easy. And we should never forget who is on the other side of this. It is a horrific, brutal terror organization. And we shouldn't lose sight of that.
What do you say to those who say that, well, Bibi, when he comes to Washington, should really only focus on the strategic issue, the most important one, which is, of course, teaming up to topple the Islamic Republic of Iran? Or perhaps secondarily, that there is a regional war that's going on right now and that the U.S. needs to work together with Israel, that would be the message. I mean, does the hostage issue seem like maybe almost a tactical one from the perspective of high politics? I mean, I know how important it is to Israelis, but when you look at the big picture, would that not need to be adjusted a bit?
No, the hostage issue isn't a tactical issue. It is a strategic issue. Aside from the moral responsibility to bring them home, it's a strategic issue for the state of Israel. It goes to the core of who we are as a society. It goes to the core of the responsibility of the state to its citizens and the social contract that exists between us. I understand why in a regional perspective, people might say we need to look at Iran. And that is true. Iran is clearly the main malignant actor in the region and a threat that we have to do a better job of dealing with. And I would argue quite forcefully that actually I think this government has taken its eye off the ball on Iran over the last year and a half, 2 years, before October 7th and since. But the hostage issue is not a tactical one. It's a moral one and a strategic one for the state of Israel. And it should be at the center of what we talk about. When you come to Washington, you don't only talk about one issue. There is space to talk about Iran, there's space to talk about the day after in Gaza, there's space to talk about the situation in the north, which can't remain as it is. It can't be that we have 70, 80,000 Israelis internally displaced with no real strategic plan for how we get them home safely.
All right, well, I want to pivot to your book. I know that's probably a topic you'd like to discuss. Your book's called The Center Must Hold. What drove you to write and edit this book? This book is, of course, an edited volume for those unfamiliar. So what's the central idea you're trying to convey here for readers in the US and around the world?
So I think there are two main arguments. The first is there is a thing called political centrism. You can identify it. It has a set of values. It's not the same as a search for the middle. It's what should be at the center of our politics, what should be at the heart of our politics. And the book lays out a clear set of values and principles. The second thing is to say, those values and principles, that political idea is the best counter we have to the politics of extremism and populism and polarization that's tearing us apart today. And look, you know, FDD deals with national security and foreign policy, so we can take it to that topic. And that is to say, if you think there are simplistic solutions to dealing with the Middle East, then you don't understand the Middle East. It is not straightforward. It's not simplistic. These are complicated things with repercussions to every decision that we take. And one of the things that the book says is there are a series of words that we can reclaim in politics that we should be talking about, that the center holds as as a core part of their identity, which have fallen out of fashion in politics, but without which we can't possibly manage the enormous challenges that we face. Words like complexity and nuance and pragmatism and moderation and even compromise. Those are core things that we need in our politics to be able to deal with the issues. Now, all of those come from and are built upon a very solid foundation of values that we have, a deep commitment to liberal democracy and a whole set of others, and something that I'm very passionate about that I think works with FDD as well, which is the idea of a kind of a strong liberal patriotism.
Well, that is absolutely something that we push for here, and we believe that governing from the center probably leads to more pragmatic and achievable policies. But let me ask you, I'm going to play devil's advocate here for a minute. Is there an argument to be made that governing from the center just doesn't work? I mean, look at the government that you were part of. I mean, didn't that government ultimately collapse, and didn't it succumb to more populist rhetoric? And isn't that sort of where Israel is today?
So it's where the Israeli government is today. It's not where the Israeli public is today. In every opinion poll you see today, you see that the public has moved back to the center right. And if there was the option of an election tomorrow morning, that's the government the Israeli public would choose, overwhelmingly rejecting, I think, the failures of our populist government. And those failures were seen before October 7th, on October 7th, and in the days that followed. So I think the Israeli public has moved back there. Our government was too narrow. There were too many parties in the coalition. But actually, if you look at the comparative success on almost every level between what we managed to do in 18 months in government and what this government has now done, and where it's left Israel or where it's put Israel after 18 months, I think our government was an enormous success. You're right that the challenge for us is how we build something that is longer lasting. And that will come from a larger majority and a more stable coalition.
Well, let me broaden out then. Are there good examples of centrist governance around the world today? Governments that have held, that are stable, and that have managed to do what you're advocating for?
Sure. So look, I try not to get into the politics of other countries too much while I still work in Israeli politics, but there are definitely examples of countries where that's successful. And I think things that you can look at as successes, I would say two of the big pieces of domestic legislation here in the US that President Biden passed were an example of centrism in action. And that's because centrists in both parties came together and said, these are critical pieces of legislation that we want to pass. So it's not necessarily about individual leaders or specific parties, but you can see places where it's successful. And I would say, and it's true that there's a criticism of the last parliamentary elections, but President Macron was elected twice in France as president, as a centrist president. I think you often have centrist focused governments in Germany for a while now. And you look in the UK, and I would argue that the UK today has probably the most centrist parliament in living memory in terms of the makeup of the British parliament today. So there are definitely examples where centrism can succeed. What it needs to do, or what we need to do, is be clear about what we believe, be strong, be passionate, be articulate, and also give no grounds to the extremists. In the end, it is the problem with some of the more moderate voices on the left and on the right is they have a tendency to excuse the extremes on their side. And what we need to do in the political center is say, actually, we can stand up to extremism wherever it comes from and reject it and fight back against it.
I certainly have found that that's the case, that folks don't want to acknowledge and don't want to clean house within their own parties. It becomes sort of a myopic view of just what's happening on the other side. But last quick question for you. I know it's hard to do this in a minute or two, but please try. I mean, how do you fight extremes with moderation? Right? Is that even possible in today's political climate? You begin to challenge the rhetoric on the other side. You note that it's insane, let's say, right? You begin to point out the extremist nature of some of this rhetoric, and then you have to somehow try to counter that, leading by example with moderation. How does that work?
So there's a few things I'd say very quickly. One is you have to offer a different type of politics. It's what in the book we talk about as the politics of hope, as opposed to the politics of fear and division. So you offer an alternative. And I think liberal patriotism fits into that narrative. And the second thing is you just don't give ground. One of the criticisms of centrism is it's too moderate, it's too weak, it always bends. And you have to actually say, no, we're going to stand up to this. Look, when I first put out the first tweet I put out about the book, instantly I was called a Nazi and a communist, depends by which side I was being attacked. And one option is to then go and hide under the table and say, please don't hurt me anymore, I don't like it. And the other is to stand up and say, no, you're not more patriotic than me. You're not more empathetic than me. You're not better at governing than me. You're not more passionate about your values than I am. And I'm willing to take the fight for those values and I'm willing to have it, and I'm willing to win it, because I care about these things as much as you think you care about your extreme views. And there is a sometimes a sense that we're not as passionate. And the way to do that isn't to talk about it, it's to show it.
Well, I can hear your passion in your voice. Thank you, Yair Zivan, for joining us today live on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thank you, Jonathan.
All right, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. Number one, on the last episode of FDD's Foreign Policy, my colleagues Cliff May and Rich Goldberg sat down with Pavel Bitorin, husband of Alsu Kormashev, an American journalist with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, who is wrongfully detained in Russia. Their conversation on Vladimir Putin's hostage diplomacy tactics and the U.S. failure to deter this behavior is particularly timely after Russia last week sentenced Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich to 16 years on bogus spying charges. That podcast is absolutely worth a listen. Check it out wherever you find your podcasts. FDD senior fellow Emanuele Ottolenghi and Toby Dershowitz, who heads up FDD Action, co-wrote a piece commemorating the 30th anniversary of the bombing of the Amia Jewish Center in Buenos Aires. That piece is up at the National Interest. For those unfamiliar, the attack in 1994 was orchestrated by the regime in Iran with lots of help from Hezbollah. My colleagues emphasize how the victims and their families still have not received the justice they deserve, with many of the known terrorists responsible for Argentina's deadliest terror attack still walking free. It probably goes without saying, but Iran and Hezbollah have been waging war against Israel for decades. This latest war is just the most recent iteration. And finally, John Hardy of FDD's Russia program has some solid analysis over at FDD's Long War Journal, where he looks at Russia's new 3-ton glide bomb, which, as confirmed by newly released footage, is being put to use in Putin's war in Ukraine. While its impact on the conflict is still unclear, Russian capabilities continue to evolve, and the Ukrainians clearly need our help. Okay, that's it for today. Read our expert analysis on our website, fdd.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD, and support our work with a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Wednesday for the 100th episode of the FDD Morning Brief. I can't believe we've come this far, and who knows how much farther we'll go. But let's take it one episode at a time, shall we? With that platitude, I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.